In the forensics of a musical icon, we usually start with the body, but with Bootsy Collins, we have to start with the distortion. We see the star-shaped rhinestone glasses, the towering platform boots, and the space bass that looks like it was forged in a fever dream. We see the grin of a man who seems to have cheated gravity itself. But the investigation into the life of William Bootsy Collins does not begin with a rhythmic groove. It begins with a cold, mathematical fracture that splits a human being into two irreconcilable halves. At 73 years old, sitting in the quiet of his Cincinnati home, far from the dry ice smoke and the deafening roar of the 1,970 seconds, arena crowds, the godfather of funk doesn't blink when he drops the most terrifying statistic in the history of the groove: 75% business, 25% music. This isn't just a cynical observation. It is a forensic autopsy of a fragmented self. To hear a man whose very DNA is woven into the history of the bass guitar say that only a quarter of his life was actually about the music is a disorientation of the soul. It suggests that for every hour spent creating a rhythm that would define a generation, 3 hours were spent in a desperate, often losing battle against the predatory mechanics of fame. The investigation reveals that while the funk was the vibrant, colorful mask he showed the world, the business was the jagged gravity that spent decades trying to pull the man back down to the mud. Before he was the cosmic outlaw, he was a kid from the grit of Cincinnati trying to outrun the atmospheric pressure of poverty. The very name Bootsy, given to him by a mother who simply liked the percussive sound of the syllables, was a small anchor of pure love in a world that would later try to trade his identity for a percentage of the publishing. The forensics of his childhood show a boy who understood movement, not as a dance step, but as a survival tactic. When the rent was due and the pockets were empty, the Collins family didn't wait for a miracle. They practiced the art of the escape. This skippity-doo-dah lifestyle, as he later called it, instilled in him a permanent sense of being untethered, a feeling that reality was something you could simply step out of if things got too heavy. But fame has a way of turning the escape artist into a prisoner. The investigation reveals a man who spent years living in a state of high-velocity disorientation, trying to maintain a persona that was becoming larger and louder than the person underneath. He wasn't just playing a character, he was being consumed by a fragmented band, ego. Bootzilla was a high-yield asset for the record labels, a colorful monster that sold tickets and merchandise, but for William Earl Collins, it was a suit of armor that was slowly becoming too heavy to carry. He paid for his immortality in painful, visceral installments, losing father figures, losing credits on songs he helped build, and watching as the business side of his life began to dictate the rhythm of his heart. We are auditing the story of a boy who drew his own destiny on the backs of napkins because the reality he lived in was too gray to inhabit. He was a visual architect of his own mythology, designing the glasses and the jackets that would eventually become his cage. This script will peel back the cosmic leather to reveal the human being who kept giving even while his internal foundation was vibrating apart under the weight of the 75%. The central question of this forensic audit is no longer about the music. We know the music is eternal. The real question is, what happens to the other 75% of a man? How do you survive when your art, the only thing that makes you feel whole, is only a fraction of your existence? We are stepping into the noise and the distortion to find the man who survived the business of being Bootsy, a survivor who proved that even when you are fragmented into 1,000 pieces of glitter, the soul of the rhythm can still find its way home. In the forensics of a legendary identity, the origin is rarely a straight line. For William Earl Collins, the world was never a solid place. It was a series of shifting floors and disappearing walls. To understand the cosmic distortion of Bootsy Collins, we must first audit the gray reality of Cincinnati in the late 1,950 seconds. This was not the vibrant, technicolor universe of the P-Funk era. It was a landscape of industrial grit, overdue utility bills, and the constant, vibrating hum of economic insecurity. In this environment, reality wasn't something you inhabited, it was something you tried to outrun. The investigation into the Collins household reveals a domestic structure built on the art of the escape. While other children were learning the permanence of home, Bootsy was learning the mechanics of the skippity-doo-dah. Whenever the landlord's knock echoed through the front door, a sound that functioned as a percussive reminder of their debts, the family didn't brace for impact. They evaporated. They slipped out the back, leaving the gray reality behind to find a temporary sanctuary elsewhere. This constant displacement created a specific forensic signature in Bootsy's psyche. He learned early that when the world becomes too heavy, you simply change your frequency. You move. You disappear. You become something else. The anchor in this shifting world was his older brother, Phelps Catfish Collins. If Bootsy was the imagination, Catfish was the gravity. The bond between them was more than fraternal. It was a biological and musical synchronization. Catfish was a quiet, focused fire, a man who treated the guitar with a terrifying rhythmic precision. In the small rooms of their Cincinnati home, lit by single, naked bulbs that flickered with the city's unsteady power, the two brothers began to build a language. It was a language of survival, expressed through the vibration of old wires and the thump of cheap amplifiers. They weren't just playing music. They were constructing a hull for a ship that would eventually carry them out of the Cincinnati mud. The forensics of this period reveal an artist who was already beginning to fragment his self-image. Long before he had a professional tailor, Bootsy was an architect of the impossible. He drew everything. He sketched star-shaped lenses on the backs of discarded envelopes. He designed jackets that looked like they belonged on a space station while he was sitting on a porch that was rotting into the ground. This was the first sign of the other 75%. He was using his imagination as a survival mechanism, creating a visual disorientation to mask the gray reality of his surroundings. He was designing the Bootsy persona long before he knew how to play a bass, building a suit of armor that could withstand the crushing weight of the business to come. Then came the pacemakers. Formed with Catfish, Frankie Cash Waddy, and Philippe Wynne, the group was a raw, electric manifestation of Cincinnati's frustration and hope. They played in the basement circuit rooms that smelled of damp concrete and cheap beer, where the music had to be loud enough to drown out the sound of the city outside. The sound of the pacemakers was a precursor to the funk, but it was still grounded in the 25%. It was honest, messy, and fiercely local. They were a band of brothers who believed that if they played hard enough, the walls of the gray world would finally stay still. But the ultimate disorientation occurred in March 1970. Fate, in the form of the godfather of soul, James Brown, intervened with a suddenness that would leave most 20-year-olds permanently dizzy. Brown's regular band had walked out over money, the first visceral lesson in the 75% business. He needed a new engine, and he needed it in 24 hours. He found the pacemakers. The forensics of this transition are jarring. Overnight, the boys who were dodging landlords in Cincinnati were flown to Columbus, Georgia, and rebranded as the J.M. Zesed. They were thrust into a world of military-grade discipline, razor-sharp suits, and a relentless, punishing rehearsal schedule. James Brown was not a mentor. He was a surveyor of rhythm who demanded total biological obedience. He didn't want their imagination, he wanted their clockwork. For Bootsy, this was a massive shift in atmospheric pressure. The kid who lived for the skippity-doo-dah was suddenly trapped in a box of perfection. He was playing the most influential soul music on the planet. Get up, I feel like being a sex machine. Soul power. Super bad. But he was doing it under a regime that had no room for his colors. The investigation concludes that this was the moment the Bootsy persona began to scream for release. He was mastering the discipline of the music, but the business side, the fines for missed notes, the rigid control, the erasure of his personal flair was beginning to grind against his fragmented band Nga. He was learning how to be the best bass player in the world, but he was also learning that in the world of James Brown, the man was always secondary to the machine. The gray reality of Cincinnati had been replaced by a glittering cage, and the escape artist was already looking for the next door out. In the forensics of a creative spirit, there is a limit to how much pressure a soul can take before it either shatters or transforms. For Bootsy Collins, the year 1970 was a high-velocity laboratory. He had been plucked from the skippity-doo-dah freedom of Cincinnati and thrown into the furnace of the James Brown machine. If the pacemakers were a band of brothers, the J.B. ES were a military unit dressed in velvet. The investigation into this period reveals a profound atmospheric distortion. Bootsy was playing at the very center of the musical universe, but he was doing it while gasping for air. James Brown was a surveyor of time. He didn't just hear the beat, he owned the clock. To Brown, a missed note wasn't a creative choice. It was a forensic failure, a breach of contract that resulted in immediate financial penalties. The investigation reveals that the 75% business wasn't just in the contracts, it was on the stage. Brown would signal fines with a flick of his fingers mid-performance: $5 for a dirty shoe, $10 for a late entrance. For a 19-year-old kid who lived in a world of sketches and star glasses, this wasn't just discipline. It was an attempt to overwrite his ego with a corporate rhythm. Yet, the forensics of the music produced in this furnace are undeniable. The tracks recorded during this 11-month tenure, Get Up, I Feel Like Being a Sex Machine, Superbad, Soul Power, became the biological blueprint for the future of black music. Bootsy brought a disoriented low end to the Godfather's sound. He didn't just play the one, he bent it. He introduced a sagging, elastic vibration that Brown, in all his rigidity, desperately needed to stay modern. But the tension between Brown's military clock and Bootsy's internal colors was growing like a crack in a high-pressure pipe. Bootsy was mastering the 25% music with terrifying speed, but the 75% control was beginning to trigger his instinct for the escape. The terminal strike occurred during a performance that has since become the stuff of psychedelic legend, the LSD Show. The forensics of that night are a study in sensory disorientation. Bootsy, exhausted by the rigid requirements of the Brown regime and seeking a different frequency, took a hit of LSD before the set. As the lights hit the stage, the reality he had been forced to inhabit began to liquefy. The investigation into his own account of that night reveals a total cognitive fracture. His bass guitar didn't just feel like wood and wire, it became a living, breathing serpent. The stage was no longer a flat surface. It was a pool of vibrating mercury. When it came time for his solo, Bootsy didn't play the disciplined, sharp lines Brown demanded. He played the distortion. He played the colors. He leaned into his amplifier, letting the feedback scream, chasing a sound that existed only in the fractured spaces of his mind. James Brown, standing at the center of his carefully constructed empire, looked at his young bassist and saw a breach of reality he could not repair. The confrontation backstage was the ultimate collision of two worldviews. Brown, the man who believed in the absolute power of the one and the law of the contract, expected fear. He expected a child to shrink under the weight of his authority. Instead, Bootsy laughed. It was a wild, cosmic, unbreakable laugh, born from the realization that the cage no longer had walls. The forensics of that moment show the exact point where Bootsy Collins ceased to be a sideman and became an independent entity. Brown fired him on the spot. Bootsy didn't just walk out, he floated. He had successfully performed the ultimate skippity-doo-dah. However, the escape from Brown was only the beginning of a much larger disorientation. The investigation reveals that Bootsy didn't go back to the gray world of Cincinnati. He drifted toward a different sun, George Clinton. If James Brown was the furnace of funk, George Clinton was the black hole, a gravitational force that sucked in every fragmented, eccentric, and discarded genius of the era. Clinton didn't want Bootsy to shrink, he wanted him to explode. Parliament Funkadelic wasn't a band, it was a psychedelic cathedral, where the 75% business was temporarily masked by a smokescreen of cosmic mythology. The forensics of the transition from the J.B. to P-Funk are startling. Bootsy traded the velvet suits for silver capes and star-shaped lenses. He was encouraged to cultivate his disorientation, to lean into the character of Bootzilla or Casper the Funky Ghost. Clinton gave him the keys to the laboratory and told him to turn every knob to the right. The investigation concludes that while Brown taught Bootsy the discipline of the music, Clinton gave him the permission to lose himself in it. By the mid-1970 seconds, Bootsy Collins had become the engine of a new universe. He was playing lines on Mothership Connection and America Eats Its Young that redefined the physics of the bass guitar. But the investigation also reveals a hidden cost. In the chaotic freedom of Clinton's world, the 75% business didn't disappear, it just became invisible. While Bootsy was busy designing the space bass and conquering galaxies on stage, the paperwork was being neglected, the credits were being shuffled, and the fragmented band Nga was becoming increasingly dependent on the very substances that had opened the door in the first place. The escape artist had found a bigger stage, but he hadn't yet realized that even in outer space, the business eventually comes to collect. In the forensics of a psychedelic empire, the line between liberation and disintegration is thinner than a bass string. By the mid-1970s, William Earl Collins had effectively completed his transformation. He was no longer a resident of Cincinnati or an employee of the James Brown machine. He was a citizen of the mothership. Under the guidance of George Clinton, the disorientation that Bootsy had cultivated as a survival tactic in his youth became a global commodity. The investigation into the Parliament Funkadelic era reveals a period of vocal and visual saturation. Bootsy wasn't just playing the music. He was the primary aesthetic frequency of a movement. George Clinton provided the laboratory, but Bootsy provided the space bass. This was the era of the cosmic Oreo, a term used to describe the layered, dense, and sweet complexity of the P-Funk sound. The forensics of albums like Mothership Connection and the clones of Dr. Funkenstein show a bass technique that was fundamentally bent. Bootsy utilized the Mu-Tron 3 envelope filter to create a sound that quacked, vibrated, and slid in ways that defied traditional musical physics. He was no longer playing notes. He was manipulating gravitational waves. The investigation concludes that this was the most liberated 25% of his life. For the first time, his internal colors were perfectly synchronized with the external noise. However, the forensics of the fragmented star reveal a darker internal resonance. As the character of Bootzilla the giant, rhinestone-encrusted monster of funk rose to the top of the charts with Player of the Year, the man underneath began to suffer from a profound identity dilution. Bootsy was becoming a cartoon of his own imagination. He lived in the star glasses. He spoke in the Bootsy voice. The investigation into his daily habits during the late 70s shows a state of permanent performance. He had performed the ultimate skippity-doo-dah by escaping into a character, but he had forgotten to leave a door back to reality. This disorientation was fueled by a radical shift in the 75% business. In James Brown's world, the business was a hammer, heavy and visible. In the P-Funk universe, the business was a fog. Clinton's organization was a chaotic collective where credits were communal and accounting was an afterthought. The investigation reveals that while Bootsy was selling out arenas and defining the sound of Black America, the structural integrity of his finances was crumbling. He was the Player of the Year on the radio, but in the boardrooms, his signature was being applied to contracts he didn't read and designs he didn't legally own. The business was no longer fighting him, it was simply absorbing him. Then came the chemical acceleration. The investigation into his drug use reveals that the LSD experimentation of the James Brown era had evolved into a daily biological occupation. For 2 years, Bootsy lived in a state of constant psychedelic oscillation. He used the drug not just for creativity, but to maintain the disorientation necessary to stay in character. The forensics of his performances from 1977 to 1979 show a man who was literally vibrating out of his skin. On stage, he was a god of rhythm. Off stage, he was a fragmented soul who couldn't remember where the glasses ended and his face began. The first visceral warning of this collapse occurred in Toronto. The investigation into his 1,970 seconds arrest for possession of mescaline reveals a moment of terminal friction. For the first time, the cosmic outlaw met the cold walls of a jail cell. The disorientation was no longer a choice, it was a consequence. But even as the law tried to pull him back to earth, Bootsy remained untethered. He walked out of that cell believing that the madness was the fuel for the funk. He didn't see the jail as a warning. He saw it as just another gray room to be escaped. The investigation into the end of the 70 seconds shows a man who had successfully conquered the world but lost the source code to himself. He had built Bootsy's rubber band. He had reached #1 on the R&B charts, and he had become a global icon of eccentric black brilliance. But the forensics of his psyche show a state of critical fragmentation. The 75% business was about to come for its debt, and the 25% music was no longer enough to keep the man afloat. The star-shaped mirror was about to shatter. The lawsuits were gathering like a storm. The credits were being disputed by those he thought were brothers, and the daily chemical use was eroding his biological foundation. The investigation concludes that by 1980, the escape artist had run out of back doors. He was floating in deep space, millions of miles away from the kid in Cincinnati, and the mothership was starting to lose power. The cosmic Oreo was being crushed, and the man underneath was finally about to hit the ground, and he was going to hit it at a velocity that almost no one survives. In the forensics of a freefall, there is always a moment where the wind stops whistling and the ground becomes an absolute, unyielding reality. For William Earl Collins, the early 1980 seconds was that moment. The cosmic Oreo had been consumed, and all that remained was the crumbs of a fragmented banga ego. The investigation into this era reveals a transition from celestial oscillation to terrestrial impact. The 75% business, which had been a fog in the P-Funk years, suddenly solidified into a series of jagged, concrete walls. The first wall was the identity war. The investigation reveals that the very image Bootsy had drawn on napkins as a child, the star-shaped glasses, the name Bootzilla, was no longer legally his. The business world had performed a forensic amputation of his persona. Lawsuits over signature-based designs and intellectual property rights began to drain his accounts and, more importantly, his spirit. Companies he had once trusted now claimed ownership of his imagination. The investigation shows a man paralyzed by the 75%. He couldn't play his signature instrument without a legal dispute. He couldn't use his own face without a contract. The disorientation was no longer a psychedelic choice, it was a professional prison. In an attempt to outrun the legal ghost of Bootzilla, Bootsy tried to ground himself in a new venture, Bootsy's, a restaurant in downtown Cincinnati. It was supposed to be a sanctuary, a physical manifestation of his 25% joy, food, music, and community. But the forensics of that business venture are a study in institutionalized failure. Bootsy was an artist of the skippity-doo-dah, not the spreadsheet. The investigation into the closure of the restaurant reveals a catastrophic lack of structural support. Licensing errors, zoning violations, and mismanagement turned his dream into a public embarrassment. 2 years after the doors opened with cheers, they were locked with a whimper. The escape artist had tried to build a house, only to find he didn't own the land it stood on. But the terminal strike, the one that finally stopped the skippity-doo-dah, forever occurred in 1984. The forensics of that night are cold and visceral. Bootsy was on a dirt bike, deep in the woods, with his blood still vibrating from daily chemical use. He wasn't looking for a groove. He was looking for a way to stay disoriented. The crash was not a slow-motion event. It was a violent, high-velocity deceleration. He was flipped through the air, a cosmic outlaw suddenly bound by the laws of physics, and slammed into the earth with a force that shattered more than just bone. The investigation into his recovery reveals a state of absolute silence. For months, the man who had defined the loudest genre on Earth lay in a hospital bed, pinned together by metal and medicine. The doctors delivered a forensic verdict that sounded like a death sentence. He might never play the bass again. The nerves were damaged, the muscles were torn, and the electricity that had powered the J.B.Z's and the mothership seemed to have been permanently grounded. This silence was different from any disorientation he had ever experienced. It wasn't the silence of the one in James Brown's band, or the smoke-filled silence of a Clinton recording session. It was the silence of a man meeting himself for the first time in 15 years. The investigation concludes that this was the most critical data recovery of his life. Without the glasses, without the stage lights, and without the chemical fog, William Earl Collins had to look at the wreckage. He realized that the business hadn't ruined him, and the drugs hadn't ruined him. He had simply lost the 75% of himself that wasn't for sale. The forensics of his psyche during the mid-80 seconds show a slow, painful system reboot. He had to learn how to move his fingers again, but more importantly, he had to learn how to inhabit his own skin without the Bootzilla armor. The investigation reveals a key figure in this restoration, Patty Collins. She became the new gravity, the steady frequency that allowed him to navigate the long climb back to reality. She didn't want the star, she wanted the man. By 1986, the last outlaw was beginning to emerge from the silence. He was sober, he was grounded, and he was profoundly changed. The investigation shows a man who finally understood the math. He stopped trying to fight the 75% business and started trying to protect the 25% that truly mattered. He realized that survival wasn't about the skippity-doo-dah or the escape, it was about the return. He had hit the ground harder than anyone expected, but in the forensics of the funk, he had found something better than gravity. He had found his foundation. The star glasses were still in the drawer, but the eyes behind them were finally, for the first time, looking at the world with a terrifying, beautiful clarity. In the forensic analysis of cultural longevity, there is a phenomenon known as secondary resonance. This occurs when a system that was once thought to be shattered becomes the primary source code for an entirely new generation of architecture. As Bootsy Collins emerged from the heavy silence of the mid-1980 seconds, he didn't return to reclaim a throne. He returned to find that his very essence had been synthesized into a blueprint for a future he had never imagined. The investigation into his legacy, post-1990, reveals a transition from personal fragmentation to legacy integration. Bootsy no longer needed to stand under a physical spotlight to be present. His fingerprints were everywhere, etched into the digital DNA of a new era. The investigation into the rise of hip-hop, specifically the West Coast G-Funk movement, reveals that Bootsy's bass lines were not merely sampled, they were treated as structural pillars. From Dr. Dre to Snoop Dogg, the space bass frequency became the language of a new black identity and urban freedom. Bootsy Collins had inadvertently become a biological library for young artists who were trying to find rhythm within the chaos of the streets. He was no longer a fading star. He was the power grid for an entire new galaxy of sound. This influence extended far beyond the mechanics of sampling. The investigation shows that subsequent generations of rock and funk musicians began to treat Bootsy as a North Star. Flea of the Red Hot Chili Peppers famously cited Bootsy as the primary blueprint for his entire career. Les Claypool looked to him as a master of courage. Victor Wooten analyzed Bootsy's bass lines as if they were sacred texts. These disciples didn't look at the glitter. They looked at how Bootsy manipulated the space between the notes, a forensic skill he had refined after years of being squeezed between James Brown's iron discipline and George Clinton's cosmic anarchy. However, the most vital chapter in Bootsy's restoration was his conscious acceptance of the role of the bridge. The investigation into his activities in the 2000s shows a deliberate attempt to reverse the 75% business ratio. Through the founding of Funk University, he began teaching young musicians not just how to slap a string, but how to read a contract, how to defend their intellectual property, and how to protect the 25% of their soul before the industry machine had a chance to liquidate it. He turned the scar tissue of his own lawsuits and exploitation into a survival manual for the next generation. The apex of this transformation is the Funk Not Fight movement. This was not a curated PR campaign, it was a forensic response to the systemic violence tearing through American communities. Bootsy realized that funk, at its core, is the harmony of different frequencies. The investigation into this movement shows him utilizing his gravitas as a survivor to convince young men to trade their weapons for instruments. In cities like Cincinnati, the same streets where he once dodged landlords, he appeared as a messenger of peace, using rhythm to heal the very wounds he had spent a lifetime trying to outrun. The Bootsy Collins of today, now in his 70s, is forensic proof that survival is its own form of genius. He is no longer Bootzilla the monster or Casper the ghost. He is William Earl Collins, a man who has finally reclaimed the 75% of himself that was lost in the disorientation of fame. He stands as a living bridge, connecting the brilliant wreckage of the past to a future he is actively helping to build. The investigation concludes that Bootsy's greatest legacy isn't the #1 hits. It is how he turned his own disorientation into a map for those who are lost in the labyrinth of the music business. He built a bridge from his own fragments, and on that bridge, the music continues to play stronger, clearer, and more authentic than ever before. In the final forensic audit of William Earl Collins, we arrive at a conclusion that defies the cold mathematics of the music industry. The 75% business, the monster that once threatened to swallow him whole, has finally been tamed, not by force, but by a return to the 25% of pure, unadulterated joy. The investigation into his final chapter reveals a man who has achieved a state of total integration. The fragments have come together. The distortion has found its perfect frequency. Bootsy Collins has spent a lifetime as an escape artist, dodging landlords, military-grade band leaders, and the gravity of his own addictions. But the forensics of his current life show that his greatest skippity-doo-dah was not running away, but running back to himself. He no longer needs the Bootzilla armor to protect his spirit. He wears the star glasses today not as a mask, but as a badge of honor, a reminder of the color he brought to a gray world. The investigation concludes that his survival is not a biological fluke, but a conscious act of rebellion against an industry designed to discard its architects. To the young musicians standing at the edge of the abyss, Bootsy's story is a forensic warning and a beacon. He has proven that you can hit the ground at terminal velocity and still find the strength to bounce back into the groove. He has shown that your worth is not measured by the neatness of your contracts or the shine of your reputation, but by the rhythm of peace you leave in the hearts of others. The space bass still vibrates, but now it carries a different message, that healing is possible, that credit can be reclaimed, and that the business will never truly own the soul of the man who refuses to sell it. Some stories end with a final bow, but Bootsy's ends with a laugh, the same wild, cosmic, and unbreakable laugh that once echoed backstage with James Brown. It is the sound of a man who outlasted the math. It is the sound of the funk, finally and forever, set free.